This meeting is being recorded.
Yep. So Robin, I'd like to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Ken. I have much pleasure in introducing tonight's guest speaker, Professor Andrew Macintosh. I heard Andrew talk a few weeks ago and was so incensed by what he had to say about the functioning of Australia's carbon credit scheme that I felt more people needed to hear him. Andrew is Director of Research at ANU's Law School with expertise in administrative law, environmental law, governance and development. He's one of Australia's leading experts on climate change mitigation and adaptation. His research has been widely published, and in 2012 he was awarded the, now I probably won't get this right, I'm sorry Andrew, but it's the Shalamadinga, is that how you say it?
Slamadinga.
So thank you. Prize for climate change research. And Google, when I looked it up, told me this was an international prize for climate change research, and it was created in memory of Dr. Bernard.
Slamadinga.
Yes, thank you. Who was a champion of climate change mitigation. Is that right? Thank you. Right. Now, Andrew's resume is quite extensive and impressive, and I'm sure this is just the shortened version. Thanks, Ken. In 2014, he was a member of the Australian Government's Emissions Reduction Fund Expert Reference Group. In 2015-16, he was on the Climate Change Authority. In 2019-2020, he was a member of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act Expert Review Panel. In 2020, he was one of 3 commissioners on the Bushfires Royal Commission. Currently, he is the program lead for Australian Government's Biodiversity, Government's Agriculture Biodiversity Stewardship Package and National Biodiversity Trading Program. Andrew, do they ever have short names? Or they always...
No, they make them incredible mouthfuls, yeah.
They do. However, it's his position as chair of the Australian Government's Domestic Offsets Integrity Committee and Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee that he was on between 2013 and 2020 that he is speaking about tonight. In 2020, he resigned as chair as he was so concerned about the integrity of our carbon offset program. You may have seen or heard Andrew recently on the news, as whenever, okay, thanks Ken, as whenever there is anything regarding carbon offsets, such as last week when David Pocock, the ACT senator, was talking about the, climate bill in Senate, then Andrew is the go-to expert for questions. And we're very fortunate to have him talk to us tonight. I'm sure you'll have many questions for Andrew, so please post them in the chat. And after his talk, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So thank you, Andrew. The floor is yours.
Real pleasure. Thanks, Robin. Thanks for the invite to talk to the group. And hello, everybody. Real pleasure to be here. I don't know if that huge rap that I just got is deserved. Certainly I try, that's all I can say. I just wanted to tonight take you through some real basics about carbon offsets and what they're meant to do, and then step you through the problems, the integrity problems with this scheme called the Emissions Reduction Fund. The Emissions Reduction Fund has 3 parts to it, or traditionally had 3 parts to it. One was this offset crediting scheme. That's the bit that I'm really going to focus on. The other 2 parts were firstly a thing called the purchasing mechanism, which is simply a facility whereby the Australian government buys those offsets. And then the 3rd part is this safeguard mechanism. I don't know how much people know about the safeguard mechanism. It's the mechanism which the new government is trying to convert into a fully fledged emissions trading scheme. It's called an emissions intensity scheme. So it's different to the schemes that have been proposed in the past. And it's building on the framework that was created by the previous government. So it's not an enormous step into a completely different regime. It's more of a hop, skip and a jump. but it is going to introduce a far more effective and system than we've previously had, and hopefully send the right incentives so we can drive down emissions and really make a dent in that economic transformation that we need to make. The reason I emphasise that safeguard mechanism and the fact that it's in the process of being changed is because that mechanism is intended to become the primary source of demand for these offsets. Now, the first question that I suppose I need to answer is, what the hell are offsets? You know, I live and breathe them both in the carbon space and the biodiversity space every day, but I often have to remind myself that there's not too many freaks like me that enjoy this sort of stuff. So for those who don't live and breathe it, the carbon offsets are essentially what they say they are. They are an instrument, a financial instrument that is given to a project proponent who undertakes an activity that reduces emissions or increases removal, so increases sequestration. So the classic example that people typically give is tree planting. So you plant trees in a place that they weren't there previously, and the trees grow, you get carbon credits for each tonne of CO2 that's sequestered in the regenerating trees. Equally, another example is landfill gas projects. So landfill gas projects involve the capture of the biogas that comes out of landfills. So when you shove any organic material underground, deny it oxygen, it'll start to decompose in the absence of oxygen, and that'll result in the production of methane emissions. So these projects capture that methane and they combust it either using a flare or electricity generator, and that converts the methane to carbon dioxide and water. And carbon dioxide is, in this circumstance, by making that conversion, it effectively neutralises the climate impacts over the cycle. While carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, in this case, it's really a net sum game in that the carbon dioxide was originally sequestered in the organic material that was shoved underground, came out as methane, it's converted to CO2 and water. So the fact it was in and out, and the net climate impact is zero. So in those circumstances, they get carbon credits for doing that activity, for neutralising the climate impacts associated with the methane. And that carbon credit is, as I said, it's a financial instrument, it's personal property, and it can be traded, it can be banked, you can pretty much do anything you want with it, you can surrender it as well. The key thing though is that they're offsets. The name says it. So what they're meant to be doing is being used by others to offset emissions that they produce. Now, when the government buys these carbon credits, it's not a huge concern if these carbon credits don't actually have much integrity. And the reason for that is that these instruments are subsidies in those circumstances because they're not really being used to offset emissions. So if we miss in those circumstances, yes, it's a waste of money, and people like me get concerned about the waste of government money, but it doesn't adversely affect the environment. That's completely different to circumstances where these carbon credits are used by an entity under the safeguard mechanism. As I said, the safeguard mechanism is essentially an emissions trading scheme where facilities that emit, large facilities that emit, are subject to a baseline, which is essentially, for our purposes, can be considered as a cap. If an individual facility exceeds their baseline, so exceeds their cap, then they've got to get credits to reduce their net emissions below that baseline. So if the credits in those circumstances don't have integrity, the net impact on the environment is actually to increase emissions. So I'll say that again. So if you're under that safeguard facility and the emissions, or your emissions are above, you've got to get a credit to bring them down on a net basis. And if those credits are not real and additional when they come from an offset source, then you're actually increasing emissions. You're making the situation worse. Now, I'll just flip now, because hopefully you can understand all of that in the basic context and why getting the integrity of offsets is so important. And it's just what I said, because if you don't get it right, you make it worse. And it's exactly the same case with a biodiversity offset. If you get it wrong with a biodiversity offset, basically you are allowing somebody to damage the environment without that compensating gain. So I'll just go to the slides now, because now I want to just talk you through what has gone wrong. But starting, before I get there, I just want to touch on this. And it's the fundamental rule of offsets. And it starts with the notion that because of that risk when you get it wrong, that offsets are a high risk environmental instrument. And it's because firstly, when you get it wrong, you make things worse, but also it's actually really quite easy to make errors in this space, because what you're trying to do is estimate what would happen if the person wasn't offered the carbon credit. So what would have happened anyway if there was no carbon credit? That's called a baseline in this context. And it's very easy to get that wrong. It's very hard because you're working with counterfactuals. So it's the margin of error is large, and it's common for mistakes to be made. When I was the chair of the committee, I made mistakes. I fully own up to them. Some of the problems that have manifested themselves in the scheme, I'm partially responsible for them. I'm not a martyr. I don't think they're fully my responsibility. And I've spent the past 5 to 6 years trying to make up and correct those errors. But I made mistakes, and that's part of the reason why we are. And I didn't do it because I was bad. I did it because it's easy to make mistakes. But because it's easy to make mistakes, and because when you make mistakes, you potentially make the climate outcomes worse, then there's this golden rule. Carbon credits should only be issued where there's high confidence they represent real and additional abatement. Now, when I say real abatement, what I mean is that there's actually been a reduction in emissions. So for example, I referred to the tree growing previously, planting trees. Well, we only want to give carbon credits when we're sure that the tree is actually growing, and those carbon credits should reflect the amount that's been sequestered in the tree. If they don't, then you don't have real abatement. The other key thing is you've got to make sure that the reduction wouldn't have occurred without the incentive provided by the scheme, and that's called additionality. So you've got to make sure they're real and additional. So what went wrong with the ERF? Well, there's two things. One, there's a bunch of proximate causes, or what I call proximate causes, and they are essentially bad rules. So bad rules were made governing project eligibility and when credits are issued. So abatement estimation is written as there. The other thing was that the Clean Energy Regulator has implemented those rules poorly in a number of circumstances. So they've misinterpreted those rules. The rules in this context are referred to as methods, or even, to make it more confusing, methodology determinations, but let's just call them methods because we're amongst friends. So they're the proximate causes, and they're the easy things to point to, and I'll point them to some examples of them shortly. But those root causes, those proximate causes, are a product of a bunch of root causes, and the root causes are really poor governance and a lack of transparency. So essentially, there was poor governance arrangements set up around the scheme, and they haven't driven the right behaviours from the regulator or a number of other parties involved in this. And so in my case, because I was responsible for ticking off on the rules, the lack of transparency ensured that, well, prevented other parties from playing in the space. And what we need here is other parties getting involved and both helping the committee and helping others to identify errors in the rules. And then when they're being implemented, when the projects start to emerge, we want to encourage other parties to get in. That aspect of the scheme has never been there. But I'll come back to that after talking you through some of these proximate causes. So in terms of the proximate causes, I'm just going to focus on what is essentially the main game associated with this offset crediting scheme that's associated with the Emissions Reduction Fund, the ERF. Now, the scheme itself is dominated almost completely by 3 project types. The first is avoided deforestation in Western New South Wales and Western New South Wales only. Projects, these avoided deforestation projects account for approximately 21% of all issued carbon credits, called ACUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, issued under the scheme. The next one is a thing called human-induced regeneration, and they account for around 28% of all issued ACUs. And then the third one is landfill gas. I'll just touch on landfill gas very briefly at one stage at the end, but I just want to focus primarily on the first 2. But between them, those 3 account for 76% of the whole program, and there's major integrity issues associated with all 3. So let me start first with avoided deforestation. This method is essentially what it says it is. It allows landholders to earn carbon credits for not clearing native forests in Western New South Wales. To be eligible to participate or to undertake one of these projects, the landholders involved must have applied for and received a specific type of clearing permit called an INS PVP prior to the 1st of July 2010. And the method is based on the assumption that if a landholder actually went to the effort of applying for and getting one of these permits, then they would activate and use them within their lifetime. That is the lifetime of the permit, which was 15 years. So that seems on the surface to be reasonably, okay, right? If someone went to that effort to get a permit, then surely it's legitimate to assume they would use it. The problem was INS PVPs were substantially, some would say massively over allocated in Western New South Wales. And they very clearly authorised the clearing of far more forest than would ever have been cleared within 15 years. To give you a taste, ultimately between 2005 and 2017, about 5 million hectares was authorised to be, or was covered, one of these INS PVPs, but total clearing in New South Wales for agriculture has very rarely got over about 15 to 20,000 hectares. Now, it doesn't require great mathematics to work out that that doesn't line up, particularly when you're confined to the areas in Western New South Wales. So clearly there was more permits issued for clearing than was ever going to be cleared. And then that raises the obvious conclusion that there's a fair risk that proponents are going to get carbon credits for not clearing forests they were never going to clear. Now, to turn that into some basic maths, the area that's likely to be eligible under the method on that premise that they got these permits and they were likely to clear them, it ranges between about 350,000 hectares up to an estimate of a maximum given by the main proponent of these projects up to about 690,000 hectares. So that means that the required clearing rate to get through that area would need to be between 23,000 hectares a year and 46,000 hectares a year. Now let's compare that to the rate of clearing in Western New South Wales where these projects are located. And that's what you get. So the blue bar there shows the average rate of clearing in Western New South Wales, the Western Local Land Services region. So it's about it's historically between 1988 and 2010, it was about 4,000 hectares per year. But the required rate of clearing to get through the areas that are eligible in the Western region of New South Wales would need to be between about 21,500 hectares and 42,500 hectares. So way, way above what the historical rate of clearing has been. Another way to show this in very simple terms is to look at both the historic rate, the rate of clearing we've seen between 2017 and 2020, and again, the required rate in Western New South Wales. So even though we experienced a significant increase in clearing in the higher rates, historically high rates of clearing between 2017 and about 2019, they were at almost historic highs from the satellite record, it was still miles below the amount that would needed to be cleared. Now, it's very simple to understand what's gone wrong here when you look at where these projects are located. And that is shown on this map here. On this map here, the green areas are areas of remnant vegetation. So areas that have not been cleared, where the native vegetation is still intact and in reasonably good condition. Now, the turquoise blobs on it are the avoided deforestation project areas. And what you see immediately is that these projects are located well to the west of New South Wales in areas that are largely uncleared or where clearing is only a small part of the landscape. That should tell you immediately that it's likely that what came forward is the areas that were never going to be cleared. And if you think about this in simple economic terms, you think about adverse selection. Adverse selection is a somewhat poncy word that's used by economists, of which I'm one, apologies. It describes certain circumstances where there's a major information difference between essentially buyers and sellers. In this case, only the landholders really know what was going to be cleared and what wasn't. And the government set up a set of rules that allows both people who weren't going to clear and those who were going to clear into the scheme. Now, for those who are never going to clear, the cost of going into the scheme and giving up their right to clear is essentially zero. The only cost they face are the transaction costs associated with participation. But think about the other group of landholders, those who were actually going to clear. If they were going to clear, it's very likely that there was an economic return that they are giving up in doing so. So you've got a pool of potential participants, one where the cost of participation is zero, but they're going to get a return from participation, and another group where the costs of participation are notably non-zero, and yet they're competing between the returns from participating and the returns from not participating. Who do you think is most likely to come forward? Ask yourself that question, and then look at the map at where these projects have come from. I think the reasonable person will reach the conclusion, after both looking at the map and looking at the statistics on the clearing rates, that it's very likely that most of the projects that we have given carbon credits have received carbon credits for not clearing forests that they were never going to clear. The other interesting point that you see from the map there is those pink dots show areas with INS PVPs, those clearing permits, issued prior to July 2010. What those of you with sharp eyes will be able to detect there is there is a number of blobs without the pink circles in them. And that means that those projects have been able to register even though that they weren't issued clearing permits prior to that cutoff date of 1 July 2010. And that suggests immediately that those projects have been registered unlawfully, which raises the question, what has the Clean Energy Regulator been doing? Now that's a taster, because this issue arises again in relation to this method. So this one is really the white whale, the biggest project type under the ERF. As I said before, they account for 28% of all carbon credits issued under the scheme. Now, the idea of human-induced regeneration is really attractive. So they allow, the method allows landholders to earn carbon credits for regenerating native forests. I'm a bit of a greenie, so I really like that idea, and I was very supportive of the idea when it was first proposed, because when it was first proposed, the idea was that landholders would get carbon credits for regenerating native forests in areas that were previously cleared. So a landholder has knocked down a bunch of trees to allow for pasture to grow, to graze animals, and they get carbon credits for reducing the number of animals on the site and stop knocking down trees to allow the trees to regenerate. And hey presto, you've got yourself a native forest again. That's a really good idea, and it's a reasonably cheap way to abate emissions. But unfortunately, most projects have actually been set up in semi-arid and arid rangeland areas that have not been comprehensively cleared. Essentially, they've been set up in areas of remnant vegetation where the degree of disturbance to the trees and shrubs in there is relatively minor. Now, that is a very bad idea. And it should strike everybody who knows anything about the bush to be a bad idea, because it tends to be hard to regenerate a native forest in an area that has never been cleared before, because there's not too many times that grazing pressure is likely to strip an area of that much biomass. To give you a taste, when I say that most of these projects have been set up in areas that have never been comprehensively cleared and in areas where it's dry, have a squeeze at this map. On this map, the grey areas show the extent of remnant vegetation, again, areas that have never been cleared, or certainly not been comprehensively cleared. And again, the turquoise blobs shown on this map show the project areas of human-induced regeneration projects. What should strike you immediately is, oh my Lord, that's a very, very large area, and it is. That area covers about 30 million hectares, which is, again, you'd all appreciate, is much, much larger than many countries. It's a huge area of land. The other thing that really strikes you there immediately is take a look at some of those projects. There's like, for example, the two projects that are in the centre of Australia on the border between Northern Territory and South Australia. These projects are suggesting that they're regenerating forest out there by simply managing grazing pressure. And they look particularly stupid, but they're not the only ones. Almost every one of those projects there is located in areas that have never been cleared. In fact, 97% of the project area of these projects is located in uncleared remnant vegetation. Now, there's two very problematic issues associated with these projects. The first one is overcrediting. So as a result of the misapplication of the model that's used to estimate tree growth, projects are being overcredited. And as I say on the slide here, the model that it's used to estimate tree growth assumes that areas have been substantially cleared, or in plain English, that they're being applied to areas where there's less than 5% of the maximum tree cover. But they're being applied to areas of remnant vegetation where most of the tree and shrub cover is still there. Very problematic. I'll explain that more in a second. The other one is that where trees are growing in these projects, it's most likely due to rainfall, not to reduction in grazing pressure. And as a consequence of that, it's likely that where credits are being issued where there is tree growth, it's likely a product of rainfall, not the project activities, and as a consequence, it's not additional. But I'll now just turn quickly to this overcrediting issue, and I apologise if this is a little bit technical, but in order to understand the humorous side of this story, you need to understand firstly what this model that is used to estimate tree growth does and doesn't do. Now, this model is called FullCAM, the Full Carbon Accounting Model. It's a relatively simple model, and it's used to estimate tree growth on an area basis. So just think about 1 hectare of either plantings or regenerating native forests. And it's based on the assumption that when the projects start, there's 0 biomass at commencement, and then the forest grows towards its maximum biomass potential. So just start with the image on the left-hand side of the screen. Just in conceptual terms, that's what the model is estimating or is based on, that you start with a paddock where there's barely anything there, might have some grasses, but barely any, or in fact 0 trees or shrubs. Then you start the project activity, in this case, the removal of grazing pressure or the reduction in grazing pressure, and that allows trees to grow. And then finally it gets to the final box down the bottom where you've got yourself a fully regenerated forest where it's achieved its maximum biomass potential. In diagrammatic format, you see it on the right-hand side of the screen. So you see there that blue line shows the accumulation of biomass in the 1 hectare area. It starts at 0 and it grows towards maximum biomass, which in that illustration is shown by the orange line. So 0 growing to maximum. Another way to show this is in this illustration here. So what I've done here is I've broken up a 1 hectare area into 16 25 by 25 meter pixels. And just as I said, if we start at project commencement on the left, each of those pixels should start at 0 because there should be nothing there, no trees and shrubs there, and it grows towards its maximum biomass potential, which is shown on the right. So in this case, I've just used 10 tonnes of carbon for each of those 16 25 by 25 meter pixels. I picked 25 by 25 because at the moment, that's how we monitor these areas using satellite imagery, Landsat imagery, and it's broken down into 25 by 25 meter pixels. So when you add up each of those 25 by 25 pixels, and each of them has 10 tonnes of carbon at max, you end up with 160 tonnes of carbon. Now, what happens if we have trees on the site that are at maturity at commencement? So I've shown this in this illustration. So you see those two at commencement, we've got 2 of the pixels that are already at 10. So they're already at their maximum. So what happens if we tried to apply the model to that site? Well, what the model automatically assumes, if you include the entire area, including those 2 pixels that start at 10, it assumes that they're not at 10, that they're at 0. So it assumes that you're actually regenerating trees that are already there. So that would be stupid, wouldn't it? So what you'd need to do is take out those 2 pixels that are already at maximum and then allow the model to be applied at the remaining 14 pixels. So it'd grow towards 140 tonnes of carbon, not the 160. Hopefully that all makes sense, even though it's in the evening, but that's literally how the model works. In order to apply the model to an area that has mature trees on it, you've got to take those mature trees out, and then you can apply it to the remaining area that doesn't have mature trees and meets the requirements that the model's based on. And so then you might ask, what's the problem then? That should all be relatively simple. Surely the method requires mature trees to be carved out of the areas that are credited and then the model applied to the remaining. And I say, yes, it does. The method does require that. How unfortunately, the Clean Energy Regulator has ignored those requirements and allowed proponents to include vast areas that have mature trees and shrubs all over them. As a consequence, what's happening is we've got shown on the right-hand diagram there, we start with areas with trees in them, and in the best case, then the other vegetation regrows. But because they had mature trees at start, these proponents are 100% for sure getting carbon credits to grow trees when those trees are already there. Now, hopefully that made sense and you're scratching your head saying, geez, that's bad. But let's get to the additionality problem, because that makes things a hell of a lot worse. Now, as I said before, most projects are claiming that they're regenerating native forests by reducing grazing pressure. Now, that might make sense if there was significant science suggesting that you could regenerate large areas by reducing grazing pressure. Unfortunately, the science does not suggest that. The science suggests that reducing grazing pressure in uncleared rangeland areas will affect ground cover and biodiversity because it affects ground cover, but it will have very limited impact on tree and shrub cover. If anything, the science suggests that grazing actually causes woody thickening, not reduction in woody cover. It's rare, if not impossible, for grazing to reduce woody biomass by greater than 95% over significant areas, as the method is based on. As I said at the outset, it's actually what we know for sure now is that the primary driver of tree and shrub cover in uncleared rangeland areas is just simply rain, the rain and drought cycle. So what happens in these areas is that you have droughts. Droughts can kill significant areas of trees and shrubs. Then you have rainfall events. Those significant rainfall events trigger germination and growth of trees and shrubs. They grow and they mature until you hit another drought, and then the cycle starts again. As a consequence of that, what you tend to see when you look at the satellite imagery is you tend to see this beautiful wave effect is that corresponds exactly with the cycle of rain and drought. In different areas, they're different. So in some areas, you see really prolonged, elongated cycles. So you can see multi-decadal cycles where you get a significant drought, you have that die-off event, and then you see a rainfall event. Typically in Eastern Australia, it's associated with La Nina events like we're experiencing right now. Then the trees grow and they grow over multi-decades, and then, hey presto, you get another significant one. In other areas, these cycles are shorter. You can see some regions, particularly in Queensland, we can see a really marked sort of 15-year cycle rather than the 30-year cycle you see elsewhere. But that signature is very, very clear. Now, the problem is that the method has makes no attempts basically to separate the impacts of rainfall from the impacts of management. As a consequence, there's a significant risk that these projects, where they are seeing tree growth, they're getting that tree growth is a product of rainfall. And I can show you what this looks like from the satellite imagery on this graph. Here, what we've done is we've tracked forest cover inside the projects that are located in the Bourke local government area. And then we've compared the changes in forest cover in the surrounding local government area. Now, what you see is the two tracked beautifully together up until 2010 to 2012. I noticed from everybody who joined it early, we don't have that many really young people. So most of us here would remember what happened over 2010 to 2012, and it was the last significant La Nina event. So what happened there? You see that the tree growth in the project areas spiked as a product of that rainfall, and it also increased across the region. Then these projects were first registered in late 2014, 2015. So we can say with absolute certainty that that marked increase in forest cover that occurred between 2010 and 2015 was not a product of the project activities because they weren't registered yet. But once they were registered, what we see is that forest cover tracks almost identically to what was happening in the surrounding local government area. The other thing that the sharp eye will pick up immediately is the fact that forest cover, since the project started, has not increased much. In fact, through the period 2015 to 2020, it basically was flat. Now, despite that, these projects continued to get carbon credits. If the projects were doing what they should be doing, is that orange line should diverge materially from the blue line, but it hasn't. And in fact, we looked at about 126 projects spread across New South Wales and Queensland, where the trends were all pretty much the same, like this. They were tracking together, no material difference between inside and outside. And the trends in forest cover inside the project area were either flat or declining. Despite that, these projects got 17.8 million carbon credits for growing forests, where manifestly they just weren't growing very much if they were there at all. In fact, the average change in forest cover across those 126 projects was, wait for it, drum roll, almost zero. In fact, the average was about 50 hectares across the project. So almost no change in forest cover, yet 17.8 million carbon credits issued for the projects. Just to show you that I'm not self-selecting one local government area that tells the story that I want to tell. This is Cobar, New South Wales, the other big part of New South Wales that has these projects. And you'll see there the trends there are actually worse than they are in Cobar. Again, they track really closely. Then we hit that 2010, 2012 La Nina event, forest cover spikes, and then forest cover since then declined, which shouldn't be a great surprise because we went through the 2017 to 2019 drought event. But the key thing here is that they're tracking together. We're not seeing a signature that the project activities are having a material impact. And also these projects continue to get carbon credits despite the fact that the trees simply, quite evidently, weren't growing and certainly weren't growing very much. Now, hopefully that has left you scratching your head saying, how on earth could this have happened? And the answer is bad governance and a lack of transparency, as I flagged at the beginning. I just want you all just to sort of step back and look at this from 30,000 feet before we go down to sort of 1,000 feet, and just think about what happens in a normal market where you've got a transaction between a buyer and a seller. I think most of you agree in most normal markets, the buyers care about quality. There's very few circumstances where we don't care at all whether we're getting what we're buying. And because of that, sellers are motivated to differentiate on the basis of quality. You know, you think about a fashion label, you know, what fashion labels are trying to do is differentiate on the basis of not only their designs and the like, but also the quality of what they've produced. As a consequence of the fact that buyers care about quality, the basic point is there's incentives to maintain quality. Now compare that to a carbon offset market, where the reality is that most buyers do not care about quality, because in most cases, what they're using that carbon offset to do is meet legal obligations, in this case, under the safeguard mechanism. Because the buyers don't care that much in many cases, the sellers don't generally care about quality either, because they don't have that inbuilt market incentive to maintain integrity. That means that the integrity of the market is absolutely reliant on the rule makers and the regulator. They're the guardians, basically the gatekeepers to ensure that this market ends up doing what it's meant to do. Now, in order for that to occur, you've got to have a bunch of characteristics in the governance structures, and I've got them here. You've got to have a strict separation of powers and roles. That's why our constitution is like it is, to separate powers between those who make the rules, those who administer them, and then the courts who enforce them. Do we have that in the case of Australia's carbon market? And the answer is a very clear no. The Clean Energy Regulator is now the rule maker. They're also the regulator, so they actually administer the scheme. They also buy the carbon credits, and then they also staff the rulemaking assessor, which is the committee that I used to chair. So they sit on all sides. Now, that is absolutely textbook bad governance structures. The whole idea of setting up the Clean Energy Regulator was to ensure that there's separation between the body that regulates and the body that makes the rules. But the government, for whatever reason, decided to mesh them together. And then they made it worse by making the regulator the buyer of the carbon credits. As a consequence, the poor regulator is now the most conflicted government body that I know of in this country. The other thing that I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, is transparency. You should be able to see almost everything associated with this scheme. You should be able to see all the documents and evidence that is relied on to make rules. Is that the case? No, you cannot. In most cases, you're not allowed anywhere near it. How about, are you allowed to see the location where the trees that are being credited, can you see them? No, you're not allowed to see them at all. It's unlawful for anybody, including me, who knows where a lot of these carbon estimation areas. I'm not allowed to share that with anyone. Otherwise, I face criminal sanctions. And the same applies to the regulator. They're not allowed to release this information. We're not allowed to see the offset reports on these projects, nor the audit reports. And we're not allowed to see, and we're not provided with any of the assumptions that are made in estimating abatement. It is, again, a textbook example of a scheme that operates in almost complete darkness. The third thing that I think is critically important to the efficient operation of a scheme like this is third-party involvement. You need to have people like yourselves. In most cases, I imagine you have no financial interest in this, but you have an interest in ensuring this scheme has integrity. You should be invited into this process. You should be able to see everything associated with how the scheme operates. And in some cases, you should even be given a seat at the table when the rules are made. Does that occur? No, absolutely not. Essentially, no third parties are allowed anywhere near, generally, to the rule-making processes. And also, third parties have no ability to appeal the decisions, the administrative decisions that are made under this piece of legislation, nor do they have the ability to seek third-party injunctions to prevent the breach of the Act. Again, across the board, all the governance structures that you'd expect to see for a faltering scheme are here, and that is the root cause for all the problems we have seen. In conclusion, and I hope I haven't bored you too much, the ERF is clearly, it's broken. There's bad rules that are badly implemented with bad governance. It absolutely needs to change. And I should have said right at the outset, my CV should tell people I'm a big fan of environmental markets and of using market forces to solve environmental problems, and I firmly believe that that can happen, but it can only happen with good governance, and that is so sorely lacking in this case. Right now, there's a thing called the Chubb Review into ACCUs, which they're looking at these issues, and I surely hope that the Chubb Review hands down a report that picks up these integrity issues, that shines a light on them, and also points a way to improving the scheme to ensure that it can do what it's meant to do. The last thing that I'm calling for and my team are calling for is the imposition of a price cap on the safeguard mechanism. And many environmentalists might scratch their heads and say, why would somebody like me be calling for that? And the reason is because in order to move from a carbon credit scheme with no integrity to one with integrity, it's going to mean a drastic reduction in the supply of offsets. That's going to set prices through the roof. And that's going to produce a whole bunch of adverse political pressures on the design of the safeguard mechanism. It's going to threaten its longevity. It's also going to subject polluters themselves to artificially high prices, which can distort their investment decisions. All these things are bad, and we can get around a lot of those bad things by putting a price cap in just for an interim period to allow some normality to return to the offset scheme, and then hopefully allow the safeguard mechanism and a fully functioning high integrity offset scheme do the work that they're meant to do. I will stop there and hopefully open up to questions and any comments that people might have.
Andrew, who
Yeah.
are the politicians who put this, who promoted this scheme? Because I assume there was political will that got it up and running. So I was just wondering who were the miscreants.
It was actually first created under the Labor government. It was known as the Carbon Farming Initiative then, and then the coalition, when they came in and got rid of the then carbon price, they replaced it. And they broadened the operation of the Carbon Farming Initiative and renamed it the Emissions Reduction Fund. I think there's a temptation here to think that all the blame lies at the feet of politicians, and I certainly think some of the blame does. There was certainly pressure to ensure that there was carbon credit supply, ensure that this scheme looked like it was working. As the scheme went on, there was also pressure to meet the increasing demand for carbon credits from large polluters, because as large polluters saw that in the long term, this safeguard mechanism was going to put downward pressure, or going to force their emissions down, they started scrambling for offsets. So it was definitely that the pressure was definitely there to ensure credit supply, which puts downward pressure on integrity. However, I think it's a too easy a story to lay all the blame at the feet of the politicians. I think a lot of the blame here actually lies at the department and at the Clean Energy Regulator. These issues were raised internally, including by me, at least 5 years ago, and I was not the only one. However, it was too easy for them to sweep it under the carpet, to think, look, this is just easier to pretend these issues aren't there. It's hard for us to admit mistake. And that, I think, is probably one of the big things, that culturally, the department and the regulator were not ready for a scheme where they are very quick to say we made mistakes, and also quickly move to fix them. And the problem was, as soon as they started sweeping it under the carpet, what happens is things get bigger and bigger. And once they got to a certain size, there became an absolute steadfast refusal to admit there were errors, because by that stage, it had got way out of hand.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry, we didn't thank you for the talk, Andrew. I thought actually Robin was going to do that, but I shall do it right now. We've got a whole stack of questions here, and I'm not 100% sure. Robin, you're on mute.
What do you want to do? I was going to address some of the questions now.
Go ahead, go for it.
Okay, but the gentleman asked a good question, which I think covers your first question, which is a bit of a cynical one, and I don't really want you to answer it, Andrew. That was the credit carbon scheme primarily just a way for the government to claim it was taking action on climate change, when in fact it was just business as usual. So I'm not going to get you to answer to that one, but maybe one of the later.
I'm very happy to. I can say that absolutely there was an element of that within the coalition government. I mean, certain ministers almost said it outright. But in terms of those who were directly involved, and in which I was directly involved, Minister Hunt was directly involved, and others, yes, we saw the political constraints under which everyone was working. But there was a real genuine desire to make it work, and to make it work as best as possible. And that's very much where it started in 2013, 2014, 2015. There was really good intent. You know, people were trying really hard to ensure this scheme had integrity. We're all fully aware that it wasn't fit for purpose. It wasn't going to drive the transformational change in the economy that needed to happen. But that intent to make this thing play its role was definitely there. But as I said, it just got out of control, and then this reluctance to admit error, the culture that needed to be there wasn't there, and then we got to where we got to.
Okay. The next questions I'm going down are sort of really more about today. And the question is from Tamara. Do you know whether the Labor government intends to fix this? So, and how and when? And I'm combining a few here. Clearly, the Labor government needs to. Oh, sorry, just somebody just clicked on it and I lost it. I
apologise. I moved things around.
Oh, did you? Oh, okay. The Labor government needs to intervene to ensure that the ERF has integrity. Is it going to do this? Now, I imagine those questions are related to the Chubb review that is going on at the moment. So can you give us any insights? I assume you will be submitting to that review. Have you any comments you'd like to give us about that?
Yeah, look, all I can say is I really hope that they do. You know, if Labor doesn't fix this problem now, they will have to fix it in a number of years. The problems that we've identified are simple, are readily identifiable by people with any degree of expertise in the field. We're the ones who've stepped out, and often my poor mug is the one that people attach this to, but I'm not working alone. There are multiple people, including in the industry, that is in the so-called carbon industry, that fully recognise this. There's a number of significant size corporate buyers of carbon credits that are absolutely 100% aware of the problems, and as a consequence are deliberately not buying ACCUs. They're buying other sorts of units and doing other things because they see it. So while those incentives are still there for Labor to deny there's problems, but at the moment, Minister Bowen, I think, has done what he should have. He's called a review by people, by Ian Chubb in particular. He's my old VC, he has a very good reputation. He's a very smart man, and I have great regard for him. And I'm really hoping that he and his panel hand down a good report. And as I said, put this thing back on the rails and we can get it done.
Thanks. And Sean, I think that really gives a response to the question you had about the integrity of where this is all going through the Chubb review.
Yeah, Robin, I'll just jump in there. The only thing I have concern about is the Chubb review is being staffed by the people from the Clean Energy Regulator and the department. I think that's pretty unfortunate. You know, the people who are accused of being involved in what's happened shouldn't be involved in a supposedly independent review. I understand why that is, because the Chubb review, the people on the Chubb review don't have deep expertise in this space. But I think it raises a few questions about how the process is actually working. I actually know a number of the staff members from the department, and I think I have high regard for them as well. But again, just from a good process perspective, it's not good to have the people who have been involved in making the methods that are under review sitting in the supposedly independent review, basically helping that independent review form a supposedly independent judgment.
So what can be done about that? Anything?
Oh, people raising the same concerns as we have. You know, there should be greater structural separation between the review and the regulator at the very least.
Okay. Submissions have been asked for the Chubb review. Could a group like us and other people that are listening tonight, do you recommend that they put in a submission?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it has to be very long. In fact, I think there's a 4-page limit on the front cover of the submission, and people can attach attachments if they want to. I'd really encourage people, if they have concerns or they have issues about this, to submit something to the Chubb review. As I said, I have the highest regard for Ian Chubb and a number of and the other panel members. And I think it's good for them to hear that there are community members out there and people who are interested in the space who see the problems that we do.
Okay, they're still coming in. Oh, I don't know about that one. What I was somebody's mentioned about the Oxford principles that seem to indicate that emissions reduction schemes should be replaced by carbon scrubbing from. Yeah. Could you make it? Could you respond to that person's question? Could you?
If the suggestion is that we should be doing less offsetting or being very cautious with offsetting, then I would agree. I think, as I said at the beginning, they're a high-risk policy instrument and they need to be used with caution. We always use the metaphor of staying in the safe part of the playground. And that's exactly right. You know, I think there's a lot of calls for carbon credits to be pushed in to solve a whole bunch of issues, including issues associated with biodiversity. While we're big supporters of using markets to solve biodiversity problems, we don't support the pushing of carbon credits to solve all biodiversity issues. Yeah, they're good for environmental plantings. Absolutely they are, and they should be used there. And there's a couple of other circumstances where they can be used, but they should be used very cautiously.
Okay. I guess that leads to somebody's asked about Green Fleet. Is their carbon offset scheme effective?
Yeah, I think Green Fleet does some really, really good work. I was only meeting the head of Green Fleet yesterday. I've worked with a number of other clients and I encourage them to work with Green Fleet. The way they work is that if you're a company that wants to offset their emissions or make a contribution to climate change, you give money to Greenfleet to establish environmental plantings, and Greenfleet establishes those plantings and manages them through time. And the idea is that the amount that you're trying to offset is sequestered over the life of those plantings. So you're basically sort of in some ways getting forward credits for sequestration that happens in the future. The reason they do it that way is environmental plantings are expensive. They cost anywhere between about $3,500 to, in some cases, about $12,000 per hectare in terms of establishment costs. So they need the capital up front in order to undertake them. So I think Greenfleet has shown it has a very good record through the years of being able to do this and do it well, and they have good processes for demonstrating what they're doing is legit.
Okay. All right. Actually, just here's a short one that Tamara asked. Should the whole idea of carbon credits be abandoned?
Yeah, it's funny. I have this debate with my wife all the time. Yeah, I like to live in hope that we can make these schemes work. And her point is, again and again, that every single time we've tried these schemes in Australia or elsewhere, they've failed. They've run into similar problems that we've encountered in the Emissions Reduction Fund. So if you look at the Clean Development Mechanism, for example, same problems. And in fact, the best estimates of legitimate credits are pretty similar to what we've come up with for the Emissions Reduction Fund. That is, at best, somewhere around 30% of it is legitimate, and the remaining 70% isn't. Very similar for the California and the US schemes, similar sort of estimates, similar analysis, similar sort of problems. Very similar for biodiversity offsetting, same problems, similar sort of things occur. As a consequence, even though I'm still a believer, I preface that with, we've got to take this stuff seriously. We've got to take those governance problems seriously, and we've got to make, really quite radical changes to the way we do things. Otherwise, we will simply replicate the problems.
Yeah. One of the questions asked earlier by Sean covers that, but he also asked at the end, what about the credits, the dodgy ones that are already into the system? Can anything be done about them?
No, unfortunately, they're already issued. It's very, very problematic to get rid of them. Even asked them, I think it's fair to say they've been pretty harsh. We are pretty harsh critics of what's going on. We're not even calling for that. What we're calling for is the immediate shutdown of a number of the most problematic projects. So those human-induced regeneration projects in remnant vegetation, we're essentially saying they should be basically, at least they should be cancelled, canned, and sent off. We're not calling for the landholders to have to hand back carbon credits in those circumstances. This was really a manifestation of a whole bunch of things, in some cases, which they are not responsible for. So let them go. For avoided deforestation projects, we're even a bit softer, and throw fruit at us if you'd like. But what we're saying is, sure, let them continue to get carbon credits for the rest of their crediting periods for the projects where they're actually being registered in accordance with a method, but do not allow those carbon credits to be used in the safeguard mechanism, because at absolutely all costs, we need to protect the integrity of the carbon credits that are being used in the safeguard mechanism, because as I said before, if they don't have integrity, the credits that are used in the safeguard mechanism don't have integrity, it'll actually definitely increase Australia's emissions.
Okay, another question, a short one. All right, how much money do you think has been wasted on this scheme?
Oh, look, already about $1 billion has been spent of Commonwealth money. Contracted total hit about 2.6 billion. The government then changed the rules and has allowed a whole bunch of projects out of their contracts. But ultimately, I think probably will end up wasting about at least $1.5 to $1.7 billion. In those terms, it's probably one of the biggest stuff ups in Australia's environmental policy history. So significant amounts, but also remember, there's a lot of private money going into this, including private money from people who are trying to do the right things, including companies. Only recently, Coles put out a carbon neutral brand of beef that was using carbon credits from those HIR projects. And we immediately did the analysis on the projects that they're using and demonstrated that there was obvious integrity problems. Now, as a consequence of that, I'm sure that Coles they did get a bad rap, and I understand they've dumped the credits from that scheme. Now, in those circumstances, I see Coles as an innocent party in many respects. Yeah, they probably didn't do their due diligence as well as they could have. However, I'm pretty sure they were actually trying to do something that's legitimate and something that had integrity. So I'm very conscious of that fact, and the fact that there's been quite a lot of private money that was well intentioned that has been wasted in and is continued to be wasted under the scheme.
So how should the targets they're looking at be adjusted then to account for these poor credits and the money lost?
For the people who are in the voluntary space that are doing it voluntarily, they're outside of the safeguard mechanism. I wouldn't punish them. At the moment, they've used carbon credits and they've done it, in some cases good faith, in some cases not, but they've done it, move along. What we need to do is stop bad credits coming out. And where we know that there are bad credits coming out, they should be clearly labelled as these are subject to integrity questions, so the buyers fully know they're buying credits that are subject to a cloud.
Okay. These credits need to be limited. This is from Dex. These credits need to be limited trade and isn't for trading with other credit. I'm quite sure. Can you see that one, Andrew? This credit needs to be limited trade and isn't for trading with other credits with integrity, and those traded credits are then burned. I'm sorry.
No. I think what the person's saying there is pretty much not dissimilar to what I'm saying, if probably a bit harsher, just saying basically, can these credits cancel them immediately? And I'm sympathetic to that view, of course. What I'm trying to do is put something before the government that they see as digestible. But I understand people who want to go further and just say, just cancel all these credits. I get it. I totally understand.
Okay. All right. And
I saw a question before, just if I could jump in, Robin. Someone asked, does this adversely affect our ability to achieve our Paris commitments?
Yes.
The first thing to know there is these credits have absolutely no linkage, no direct linkage between the issuance of these credits and our national accounts. Right, the national accounts account for emissions and removals. They do not account for ACCUs. So the only linkage between when ACCUs are issued in the national accounts is if they have integrity, if the carbon credits have integrity, it should result in the avoidance of an emission. So basically an emission that would have otherwise turned up in their accounts, or it should result in an additional removal because we've promoted the regeneration of vegetation that otherwise wouldn't have been there, and that removal will turn up in their national accounts. But of course, where these credits don't represent real and additional abatement, nothing. We get nothing in the national accounts. And unfortunately, as I said before, this is largely what has happened. We've paid for and allowed for the issuance of vast numbers of credits, and they just simply are doing nothing to helping us achieve our targets.
It's not good, is it? Okay. Do you want to have a look at the last couple of questions? So thanks for that about the Paris targets, because I'm sure everybody would not be aware that that's the case. And from Stephen, are oceans around Australia part of the carbon offset calculation?
The straight answer to that is no. No, they're not. The only place where supposed blue carbon comes into the national accounts at the moment is mangroves. Mangroves, of course, a type of forest, and there's attempts to account for it. If I remember, and I should remember this because I've been on the inventory committee for more than a decade, I think there's also been some attempt to account for some sequestration in seagrasses, but in a limited number of circumstances. But absolutely, mangroves are in. I think seagrasses are in now in limited circumstances, nothing else.
Okay. Kyle's question, compared to the rapid adoption of renewable energy sources and direct restoration efforts for forests and grasslands managed directly by the government hired team, is this initiative ineffective and perhaps a waste of time?
Kylie, the very simple answer to that is yes. We would have been far, far better to spend the government resources that have been spent on this directly investing in renewables and direct forest restoration efforts.
I was going to one that was above. Is the emissions reduction fund exempt from freedom of information, Dex asks?
It's not, but the Clean Energy Regulator administers its responsibilities under the FOI Act in a way that effectively ensures that they don't release information. To give you an example, we've raised a whole bunch of integrity issues with a method called the plantations method, and the regulator has not publicly come out and detailed why it thinks we're wrong. It's gone around and done a whole bunch of private briefings without showing us anything what it's saying. But of course, those private briefings come back to us because it keeps forgetting that we have better contacts than they do amongst various entities. As a consequence of that, we then FOI'd them and asked them for a bunch of information that they had to have relied on in making the method that go to the integrity issues we've raised. I've only yesterday got the reply back from the Clean Energy Regulator. They identified 9 documents that fell within the scope of what we requested. They completely blocked 8 of the 9, and then the 9th was a nonsense document. It was basically a draft of a document that's now publicly available. And they did that on nonsense grounds. They said that the release of information would jeopardise its ability to administer the scheme, which I think is funny. And then they blocked the others on the grounds that the material was deliberative. Now that's just nonsense, right? You know, in order for us, and I mean all of us, to have confidence that the scheme has integrity, we must be able to see the supposed evidence that they relied on in making the methods, but they're blocking the information, and they routinely block information that is incredibly relevant to the integrity of the market.
Gee, that's pretty sad, isn't it?
It's very sad. Yeah, it's very sad for an Australian government regulator. I personally have never, ever in my lifetime, and I've worked with government bodies in Australia, I've worked with government bodies overseas, I've worked for government bodies overseas. I have never in my entire life seen in a developed country a government agency behave the way I've seen the Clean Energy Regulator behave. I won't go into great details, but it's been truly extraordinary.
It's a bit of a cynical question. Would we find the network of landowners with these INSPVPs have any relationship with the government? In other words, is there any colluding? I think is what the question means.
No. The mistake with avoided deforestation was one that I know the people who are driving the method and drafted the method, the Commonwealth officers that did it. It was just a classic stuff up. The cover up that followed wasn't accidental. The stuff up, the bad design at the beginning was just simply a bunch of bad, honest mistakes were made. And then, as I said before, when it became obvious that a mistake was made, people just did not have the gumption to stand up and say, we made mistakes. And again, I say, I was there, right? I was there when I wasn't there when the method was originally made, but I was there when it was transferred to the ERF. I raised concerns, but honestly, I didn't fight hard enough. I should have fought much, much harder, and I didn't. And I'm partially responsible, and I take responsibility for that. And people want to send me hate mail, by all means do. But again, I say that the culture we need in this sort of space is one that accepts that errors are going to be made, but then actively expects for errors to be made, hunts them down when they're found, quickly identifies them, quickly owns them, and then fixes the problems in the methods to ensure that those problems don't balloon like they have here.
Okay, nobody ask any more questions because Andrew's never going to get away tonight, but just quickly, the last couple that have popped up. Would the government running a scheme like Greenfleet directly be a practical proposition?
Yeah, it would be. In fact, we persuaded Minister Littleproud to set up a scheme called the Carbon Plus Biodiversity Pilot, which is based on principles that are not dissimilar to what Greenfleet does, and it has been very successful. We have run 2 rounds to date, and we've had quite a lot of interest from landholders. The Queensland government ran a not dissimilar scheme, and so is the Western Australian government. So there's definitely the scope to run it, and it's definitely viable. What we're trying to do now is persuade the new government of the merits of such a scheme, and the ability for both government to run schemes like this when it supports that sort of reforestation efforts, but also tries to draw in private capital to support those sorts of efforts, but in a way that is feasible for private capital to get involved.
Fantastic. No more questions. Stephen asked, what happens to carbon credits gained or earned after the bushfires?
Typically the golden rule, hello Kat, typically the golden rule is that where you've planted trees, for example, or regenerating forests, and then it burns, that you don't get any more carbon credits until the forest is regenerated. So you don't have to give carbon credits back when it burns and biomass is lost, but you have to ensure that the forest regenerates. If it doesn't regenerate and get back to where it was, then you ultimately will have to hand back credits, but you're allowed time to allow it to regenerate. I think one thing that's often forgotten with bushfires in the wetter sort of temperate forests that burnt during the bushfires, there's a belief that, oh God, all the carbon is lost. It's absolutely not the case. In fact, in a lot of the dry forests that burnt during the 2019-2020 fires, only about sort of 10 to 15% of the carbon in the forest is actually lost. And it's because almost all of the debris that is on the ground is lost. And many of you would have walked through a lot of those forests. The debris is all completely gone. But a lot of the live biomass in the trees is still there. Even if the trees die, you'd note that the tree is still there. And as a consequence, a lot of the biomass, the carbon, is still stored in the forest. And then those forests, those dry forests, actually regenerate really quite quickly. You get that epicormic budding, which is so distinctive, and the forests come back quite quickly, and the debris pools build up quite quickly as well. So the losses are nowhere near as significant as you might think. It can be different in some forests, in what are known as obligate cedars. Some of those forests can incur more significant losses, but even there, the carbon does come back far quicker than what you might think.
Excellent. Okay, Howard's asked, will you answer about national accounts? I take it you have high confidence in their accuracy.
I wouldn't say that I have high confidence in that they're accurate. What I have high confidence in is that there's no deliberate manipulation of the accounts. When you get to, in certain sectors, I have both high confidence in the accuracy of it, and again, high confidence that there's no attempt to manipulate it. So certain sectors, think about coal generators, gas-fired generators. You know, we know what the emissions associated with the coal that is burned is going to be with reasonable confidence, so we can put good error bars around it. Things get more tricky in things like the land sector, where there's much greater uncertainty about what the amount of biomass in each of those 25 by 25 pixels are, and how much is regenerating, those sorts of things. So there's quite a large error bar there, but I'm pretty confident that there's no deliberate attempt to manipulate the accounts. It's error or a lack of data which drives the inaccuracies in most cases.
Okay, quick question that actually Frauke asked right at the beginning. Why just Western New South Wales?
Oh, it was because of those permits. That logic of we need to know that those forests would be cleared. And in that case, the fact that there was these permits, these 15-year permits, was meant to be the thing that gave us high confidence that those forests would be cleared. Got to remember, there's 134 million hectares worth of forest in Australia. So the idea that you turn up and say, oh, you can get carbon credits for not chopping down your forests, again, you'll hit that adverse selection problem, and we'll get 132 million hectares worth of forest turning up claiming that they were going to clear them and they want carbon credits for not clearing. So it's just the fact that there were these long-lived permits that were issued that authorised clearing, which was meant to give confidence that we knew that these areas were going to be cleared. In most other jurisdictions, those clearing permits only have 2-year lifetimes, in some cases even shorter. So it's just not practical. They're out of date by the time you design the method. And the last thing you want to do is give people an incentive to apply for apply for clearing permits, so they then can apply for carbon credits for not activating the clearing permits, because that just creates a gaming problem, and people will do that. We've even seen a case where a landfill gas operator turned off their generator for several years in order to manipulate their baseline under that method so they could get more carbon credits when they turned it back on again. Just a classic illustration of people will find ways to game methods where there's an opportunity to do it.
Fantastic. I've been sent a private message to please ask this one. Last question, definitely the last question, Andrew. PowerShop is now offering carbon offset gas. Is it worth opting for this if you haven't got any other source of heating, or is it just greenwashing, or is it the real deal?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't pay extra to offset anything unless I knew absolutely 100% exactly what projects were being used to offset. So with, as I said before, something like Greenfleet, and I pick Greenfleet not because I want to spruik Greenfleet, but other operators like that are undertaking projects that we have high confidence in, fine. But the idea of ticking a box, letting someone else choose what offsets can be used, there's absolutely no way in the world. Same with things like Energy Australia, I think has an offset option. No way would I be signing up for that. And until someone can show me that the projects that they're using have high integrity.
Fantastic.
Otherwise, I mean, literally, in practical terms, you're literally just passing a check and it's a transfer payment. It's like paying welfare to somebody in circumstances where they're not deserving of welfare.
Okay, I'm going to let you go. There's already lots of people saying thank you, Andrew. And can I say thank you to you? Your talk tonight was just as insightful as I expected, and I enjoyed it, I think, even more tonight because I could actually concentrate on more of what you were talking about, because, you know, some parts of it were quite, you know, in depth. And can I say that perhaps might another time in the future, maybe after the Chubb review is out, maybe you might like to be able to come back and talk to us again. And I'm sure from all the comments that you can see coming up that we'd all love to hear you again.
Oh, I really love it, Robin. You know, it's really great that groups like yours are out there. So anything I can do to help. I'm not exactly the greatest font of knowledge, but again, as I said at the beginning, I'm a real trier and happy to help your group and others wherever I can.
Can I say, can you get onto social media a bit more? Apparently the feedback I got was you don't have a very big social media profile. So, because we want to get out to young people, it's their future we're working with. And as you said, most of us here, there are some young bodies, because I know some of the names, but we do want to get out to the young people. And how do they find out things these days? It's through social media. So that would be my recommendation for you.
If there's any of your members that know anything about social media and want to give me a hand, then I'm all ears, because I'm a complete numpty when it comes to anything like that. Even though I've got 3 children, including 2 teenage daughters, who spend their entire lives on social media, they won't help me. But if there's anyone out there who can help me, I'd love to hear from you.
There you go. Definitely something that needs to be taken up. But Andrew, thank you. You for giving us all this time. I don't think anybody's left, although we said it was only till 7:30. What you were saying was incredibly interesting and something that I think a lot of us don't have great insight into, but I'm sure we go away tonight with a much better understanding. So thank you. And we've already got an offer from one of it. I can teach you a few things if you like. Keep in touch then. There's so we're training people, basics of video. You've got a few offers out there, Andrew. We'll get back to you.
Fantastic. I'd love to hear from them. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night and best of luck.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks. Anyway, that concludes tonight's proceedings. I'll just stop recording.